Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So for today's sketchbook session, I did end up filming this I think over 2 weeks ago. So I don't really remember every thought that I had when making this particular sketch page, but I do remember that I wanted to do something a little bit with more inking and something a little bit more kind of like monochromatic than compared to my other marker kind of little sketch pages I usually do. I think kind of more recently I've been drawing my OC Akemi a little bit more, so that's what we're going to be drawing today for, I guess, like the character of choice, since usually when I plan out like spreads like this, it's kind of fun to do one particular character and then kind of pose them differently and kind of like jigsaw or a way to kind of fill up the space for the entirety of the spread. So to start off, I am going to be starting in the bottom left hand corner, and we'll kind of make our way towards the right hand side. So also, if you ever see me record and my sketchbook's kind of at an angle or it's kind of not in frame, usually I kind of film the sketching portion to some extent, but I do not have plans of showing it sometimes. So at this point, I wasn't sure if I was going to include the sketching portion, so I just made myself comfortable with the angle of the book being more propped up so that I could see how I was drawing Akemi a little bit more proportionally versus if I were to draw in my sketchbook completely flat horizontally down, just because I was a little bit wary of making the proportions a little bit too skewed otherwise. So I am using my multi-pencil for now for the sketching portion. So I wanted to use more of a cooler toned base for my sketches. So usually when I do sketching like for marker videos or just like in general where I'm going to be doing line work or I'm adding color to it a little bit later, I tend to lean towards more the warmer side, and I usually use the red Pilot Color Eno, or in this case the Uni Dia color, I think Uni Color Dia, one or the other, and red is kind of like the base, or like pink will be. But for this one, because Akemi I kind of feel like has a bit more of a cooler toned color palette, I wanted to stick with kind of like a warmer blue in a sense. It's almost like a purpley blue, especially on camera, and I think it'll blend a little bit more nicely with the markers that I plan to use. But then again, this time around, because I wanted to do it more monochromatic, I am going to be erasing the sketch quite a bit to kind of keep things a little bit more clean, and I'll get to that after we finish the inking portion. So here's a quick close-up of the little sketches of Akemi, and I tried my best to fill up the space as much as I could in terms of, you know, if I have any spaces, I try to fit like maybe a headshot, add some text, add some extra details, you know, kind of fill up more of the body if I can, to kind of fill up that space as much as I can. So for the line work, I am going to be using the Ohuhu Fineliner pens, and the reason being is that I find their pens to have a good range of nib sizes, or like the pen sizes. So I'm going to be using 3 different ones today. So the first one I believe is the 0.2. Like I said, I filmed this like 2 weeks ago, so I do not really remember if this is the correct one. It's either the 0.1 or the 0.2, and I'm using this as the kind of main pen for line art, just because I wanted thinner lines for adding detail and just being a little bit less meticulously going to be kind of like using one stroke per line. I don't mind if I'm going to be a little bit more scratchier, or if I have to build up a little bit more of line width variation with the thinner pen. With a thinner pen. So even for hair and stuff, you can see I'm filling in some of those gaps to make them a little bit more darker, and that will help with depth a little bit. But I'm also going to be adding a little bit of hatching here and there for his hair, for some blush, for in the eyes, I think for any shadows and stuff. But because of like Akemi's clothing, he does have a very dark turtleneck underneath a very light kind of dress shirt. So for the turtleneck portion, I do want to kind of shade it in and block it in a significant amount, but using a 0.2 sized pen is not going to be ideal for that unless you want carpal tunnel and you really want to burn through that pen. So later on I will be switching to 2 other pens to make it a little bit easier for me to transition the hatching a little bit more easily, but still making it look a little bit more natural in a way. I kind of forgot to mention why I'm doing things a little bit out of order for at least myself. So if you're familiar usually with my process and when I plan to do any kind of like marker session that is water-based, I like doing line art last so I don't really have to worry about smudging or anything like that. So you can see that I'm doing inking first, and what would be the reason why I'm doing inking first is that I am going to be using alcohol markers to do the kind of blocking in of colors for today's piece, or color I guess, since we're going to keep it very simple and kind of more monochromatic. But you can see I like using this thinner pen to do more of the finer details like the blush, some of the shading in the hair, but some of the darker areas right here, the 0.2 is going to struggle a little bit if I want to do just like larger flat areas of black. So I am going to switch over and do a kind of using two different kind of pens. So I have one that's like 1.0, which kind of feels more like a felt tip marker. It's very much like bullet nib-esque, so it's easy to use to fill in such larger areas. But then I'll transition that to a 0.5 or a 0.7, and then after that I will also switch it to the 0.2 again if I want to go back and make thinner lines as we transition from the flat black to kind of our cross hatching or hatching as we move from dark to light. But the thinner pen is still kind of my favorite, so even though I don't ink a whole lot, I definitely prefer thinner pens versus thicker pens because they, for at least for me, they resemble a little bit closer to mechanical pencils, which I'm very used to using. So I feel a lot more comfortable handling that kind of similar width of a pen, I guess. And I just feel like it just looks kind of nice adding the smaller details while we add flat color a little bit later. So I tried my best to include as much of the inking process in kind of real time, just because a lot of people find inking to be very soothing or satisfying to watch. I'm not sure particularly like my own line work, just because I feel like I fuss a little bit too much, or my lines are a little bit wobbly at times or a little bit inconsistent, so I don't know if it's too satisfying, but I definitely like watching back my inking sometimes because I can kind of see my choices, or kind of just, I don't know, I like seeing people ink as well, so it's kind of nice to view it from the other side afterwards, especially because it has been 2 weeks. I don't really remember too much from this particular spread, so hopefully at the time of it I wasn't too stressed about the inking, because at this point I think I was having fun just playing around with some of the hatching, playing around with some of the darker areas, and hopefully using the line work. Oh wait, I know this portion. So I initially sketched out Akemi holding like a few rolled pieces of paper in his arms, but I think I got confused on where his sleeve started and stopped versus the paper, so the papers look very funky and it doesn't really look correct, so please ignore that as we move on to the next little Akemi that I'm kind of inking right now. I definitely think like inking the eyes and just like adding blush or like the smaller details is kind of like more of the fun areas to ink. So as I'm adding like, I guess like the darker areas with the larger pen, so the 0.7 and the 1.0, I'm trying my best to make some areas that have more flat blacks or just areas of more condensed value, if that makes sense, so that when I add in my flats I don't have to worry too much about it looking too flat compared to if I were just to color everything as like one flat wash. So hopefully once we get to the marker section I can kind of show you guys how I like to add my flats in a way that kind of lends itself to having still a light source, and we can keep in mind of some of the shapes and the forms, especially for like the hair and the clothing, if anything. Drawing circles for like Akemi's glasses will be forever the bane of my existence. I can never draw them like super well, and I think the one that I'm currently working on, his left lens was really wonky, but hopefully it doesn't look too off, if anything. But for the most part, I'm still gonna consider these kind of like sketches to a certain extent, especially like the smaller one of I guess like the one that I'm currently working on now, because I'm keeping it simple. I don't really mind if some of the lines don't fully connect. I'm just kind of keeping it loose. And then once we do the coloring, I'm also going to treat it very much like not super meticulously planned. We're just going to fill in things where I kind of see fit. But I might see if I can look into some other pens that I can use for inking, because as much as I like these kinds of fine liners or like technical pens kind of fall into the same category, I'm always worried about kind of like burning through the nib a little bit, because they kind of have that felt little tip, or like a tip that kind of can bend and be pressed in and over time will lose its shape. Or if you're heavy-handed like sometimes I am, the shape will be really misshapen to the point where it's really hard to use sometimes. So I want to see if I can find a needlepoint pen with ink that's a little bit more compatible with this notebook paper. So hopefully one that ghosts a little bit less and also can provide kind of smaller, thinner lines without needing a whole lot of dry time. So I'm probably going to try my best to find a pen that will suit my needs, because if technical pens were like the same as is, but except the tip of it was a needlepoint, then I think that would be the most ideal for me. Because my current needlepoint pens that I used to like using, which I used to use in more like thicker sketchbook paper, but this is like thin notebook paper, so ghosting is very apparent. The ink dries quickly to a certain extent, but I feel like it slightly feathers, and then it also kind of is a bit too thick for my liking in terms of the pen nib size. I feel like the Hitec C is probably the closest that I'm probably going to get to something that I potentially could like. So I might dig around and see if I have any Hitec Cs left kind of remaining, and if I like them, maybe I'll just go grab a set of them. Because like I mentioned, I love technical pens and fine liners and stuff, but just for some inking, it just is a little bit more of a hassle because of how I work. And I could just be more careful instead, but I'm going to see if I can find something that allows me to be a little bit more reckless with my inking. Otherwise, I might end up not using inking too much in my sketchbook anyways, like other than the fact that I want to use them as like a way to kind of tighten up a drawing or to add detail or make things stand out at kind of like the end. And for the most part, I've been trying to make ballpoint pen work for me in that sense. But kind of moving along, I am needing my kneaded eraser so we can prep it to erase a lot of my sketch for Akemi. So for the most part, I did erase a good amount of the sketches, especially like around his face. I think the one that I didn't erase as much is probably the bottom right one. So I tried my best to get as much of the kind of sketch kind of away from the face, or just to lighten it enough so that it doesn't really impede with the color that I choose in the end. But like I said, because I'm choosing something very monochromatic and something a little bit more on the cooler side, I don't think it's going to show up too blatantly compared to if I use something like pink or red. So I went ahead and chose these two colors. I was still debating on whether or not I was going to add kind of like two different values to Akemi's kind of like clothing and the sketches and stuff, but I decided that I would just stick with the one color and see how I liked it, and if I wanted to, I will add more value if I really wanted to push something. But I think this appeared dark enough against the kind of like notebook paper, but it was light enough compared to the black that I think it worked really nicely for what exactly I wanted in terms of doing the flat colors. But one thing I did notice, so the reason why I wanted to do alcohol markers in the first place for this particular sketching session, whatever you want to call it, is that I wanted more flat areas of color because it will look kind of cool if it's flat and kind of has that monochromatic look. But I noticed that there's still quite a bit of streaking, so I'll probably show it at the very end that compared to other alcohol marker drawings, the streaking becomes a little bit less apparent when I start to blend up a lot of different colors together and kind of layer up multiple layers of color at once. But for these ones, because I'm not going back and forth super a lot, I guess. It's not giving me a super flat look. It's not too bad, like compared to water-based markers. It's definitely less streaky and it's more flat, but it's definitely not fully like lacking in some kind of like streakiness or like kind of the cloudiness of it. So part of it could be just the way how I ended up coloring everything, but part of it's also because the notebook paper reacts a little bit differently compared to maybe thicker paper where I could use to get kind of more flat areas of solid color if it doesn't seem very like cloudy and kind of a little uneven, if anything. But as we're kind of going through the flats I would consider for Akemi, I'm kind of shading in areas that if they're not going to get hit by light, in my opinion, I'm going to do more of a solid fill. But if they're going to get hit by light, I am going to take in consideration the form and just like the shape of the clothing or the hair or whatever I'm coloring into consideration. In this way, it kind of gives a little bit more depth, even though I'm keeping things fairly flat, but also it makes it a little bit more fun to color in this way instead of coloring it like a coloring book where you're just blocking in kind of like one solid color for each portion. And this way it's also a little bit easier for me to, hopefully, if I'm following the directions of like the clothing folds or the hair, minimize that streaking to a degree. It's definitely most noticeable in Akemi's pants, but I did more of a flicking motion, very vertical kind of stripes, if anything, rather than doing circles or something that might get a little bit more of even coverage. But maybe I'll experiment doing another spread like this, but with 2 colors, because the Ohuhu markers that I currently have a very nice range. So I would like to play around with some other color combinations that I can't really do with the water-based markers. Oh, you can see the ghosting. So this is why I don't use alcohol markers too often in the sketchbook, because the ghosting kind of is almost 1-to-1 with the amount of ink that seeps through. Here's a bit of the close-ups for each of the little sketches or doodles. So I tried my best to keep the shading simple, and the line art kind of really helps tie everything together. And I'm going to show you guys kind of a little comparison to previous alcohol marker drawings that I've done in the past, because you can get smooth applications to some degree, but it definitely requires you to either layer or blend. So this is what water-based markers look like. You can see it's a little bit more streakier, but it's not too bad actually. But here you can see it's a little bit more smooth looking, so it's probably because of all the blending and all the layering of colors. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's session. I'll definitely do another one in the future with more colors, but I think that's it for today, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!